Oh, hello everyone. Welcome to our sixth graduate student panel. It's about the home and displacement. So why not start now, and let me introduce our first presenter, Linda. Linda is a PhD candidate in Academy of Film at Hong Kong Baptist University. And Linda, do you want to start now?
Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Linda O. It's very nice to share with you my latest research on Hong Kong cinema and the Cultural Cold War. The title of my presentation today is Where's My Homeland? Hong Kong Tenement Films During the Cold War Era. Tenement drama was once a cinematic form of astounding popularity in Hong Kong. Films as such showcase the lives of urban lodgers from diverse social and cultural backgrounds, who typically dwell in cramped partition rooms or bunk beds and share facilities in the communal area under one roof in contemporary Hong Kong, ending with an emphasis on the importance of solidarity and mutual support among the tenants to overcome a variety of social crises. The classic tenement drama has long been regarded as a highly politicized mode of representation favored peculiarly by the left-wing camp, but indeed it has been utilized by the right-wing film artists as well. So far, there is no an in-depth study in literature to compare Hong Kong tenement films as the embodiment of the Cold War ideologies of opposing political forces for scrutinizing the cultural dimension of Cold War conflicts in Hong Kong. Hence, combining textual analysis with archival research, I examined a couple of Hong Kong tenement films of the 1950s in this paper in respect of how tenement was deployed in cinematic storytelling to depict myriads of socio-historical problems encountered by the diasporic Chinese communities in post-war Hong Kong. In particular, I will delve into Hong Kong's social and cultural milieu for the popular portrayals of refugee experience, the political functions of the tale of exile, and the contentious meanings of the concept of homeland through a Cold War lens. As it will be clear, the production, circulation, and reception of a series of tenement dramas in the 1950s Hong Kong cinema was strongly shaped by the ongoing influence of the global Cold War politics and the British imperial politics, which reflects Hong Kong's crucial geopolitical position as a locale of Chinese diaspora and the battlefront of the psychological warfare in Asia amid the Cold War. During the Cold War, owing to its proximity to mainland China, of which the border was closed, and its abundant supply of Chinese talents who were migrants, refugees, and emigrants from the inland, British Hong Kong was transformed into Berlin of the East, an intelligence and propaganda front between the newborn communist China and the US-led liberal camp in alliance with the exiled nationalist regime in Taiwan for the Cold War battles to win the hearts and minds, targeting not merely at the local residents in Hong Kong, but also at the large ethnic Chinese population in Southeast Asia and around the world. With its long-established distribution network stretching across Southeast Asia and the Pacific for the overseas Chinese moviegoers and numerous southbound film workers equipped with rich filmmaking experience and savvy business strategies, Hong Kong cinema was on the front line of Asia's cultural Cold War. In fact, the colonial Hong Kong offered a relatively safe haven for the Chinese migrants and refugees from the war-torn mainland on a massive scale in the first half of the 20th century. The sudden population explosion inevitably inevitably engendered a plethora of widespread social problems, the most grievous of which were mass unemployment and housing shortage. What's worse, the US-led embargo on communist China in the early 1950s brought tremendous economic hardships to Hong Kong. At this juncture, Hong Kong film artists from disparate ideological camps felt the urge to make social realist films to describe the sufferings of Chinese migrant refugees in the British colony and to express their attitudes towards New China and True China. Making use of the cinematic form of tenement drama, they provide lifelike representation of multifarious social problems confronted by the diasporic Chinese communities in post-war Hong Kong with contesting narratives of homeland. In order to galvanize the support for the local and overseas Chinese for the Communist Revolution and the new regime, the CCP and the pro-Beijing patriotic film community succeeded in setting up a Hong Kong-based interconnected network of production and distribution facilities in between 1950 and 1953, aspiring to bring the story of New China to the diaspora Chinese spectators across the region by taking advantage of Hong Kong as a window, abbreviated as Changfengxin today. These influential leftist studios were actually sponsored by the Beijing government, though they strive to hide this fact by disguising themselves as private enterprise with investment from overseas Chinese to avoid raising any suspicion. Given that the local markets in the colony was not big enough for Hong Kong film companies to maintain their livelihood when New China Store was closed to Hong Kong cinema in 1950, many of them turned to Southeast Asia and Taiwan for a substitute economic lifeline. But the cutthroat lead-right competition over local and overseas film markets actually served a larger political aim for the identity politics of the diaspora Chinese communities in a globalized Cold War context. And the post-war Hong Kong cinema was more than a popular entertainment, but a cultural expression. In this situation, Hong Kong leftist film cultural workers sought to promote their progressive ideology, vision for a new Chinese society, and a sense of unity and community through cinema to the Chinese diaspora, which was consistent with CCP's policy to make use of Hong Kong as a strategic location to build a bold united front, forming alliance with supporters of all kinds and winning the hearts of the politically neutral. Home Sweet Home is a Mandarin film produced in 1950 by Changchun Movie Enterprise. The film portrays that a young man and his fiancée moved to Hong Kong from the turbulent mainland at a time when the Chinese Civil War is drawing to a close. During their journey to the south via Canton, a large portion of their money and treasure are confiscated rudely by the Kuomintang soldiers. When they finally arrive in the modern metropolis in the hope of starting a promising new life, they settle down in a cramped and spartanly furnished lodging house. Under the same roof, there is a crowd of dwellers, most of whom are the petite bourgeoisie and the working class from all walks of life. Beyond their expectation, life in the British colony is by no means happy or easy, but rife with temptation, deception, exploitation, and misery. Feeling unbearable to the harsh environment and the humiliated sufferings in Hong Kong, this cohort of prosaic Chinese migrants leave the cursed city together by train for their homeland when they hear that China has been liberated by the CCP. The political message in the film is palpable, that is, to condemn the corruption of the nationalist government, foreground the colonial ordeals and the hypocrisy of the capitalist society of Hong Kong, and support the triumph of the Chinese Communist Revolution with a newly found patriotism. Similarly, Longma Films, a sister studio of Changchun in the leftist camp, produced the show Must Go On in 1952. The film pictures the plight and the struggle of an acrobatic troupe consisting of a bunch of mainland refugees taking shelter in Hong Kong during the Chinese Civil War. When their fellow acrobats who just come back from the mainland bring them the news that China's political and economic situation has considerably improved after liberation, the troupe eventually gives up its nomadic way of life in the Crown Colony, where they are desperately plagued by mass unemployment, abject poverty, and glaring social inequality, and returns to their homeland enthusiastically for a new life. The film has an anti-nationalist slant, which is expressed explicitly at the beginning of the story by explaining that this group of Chinese circus performers go into exile in Hong Kong because they can hardly survive in a corrupt society at the hands of Chiang Kai-shek-led nationalist bandits. In view of an intense Cold War ideological battle fermenting in the territory with the threat of the ever-expanding communism, the British authority took rapid action to stem the rising leftist influence in Hong Kong cinema, such as arrest and expulsion of more than 20 leftist filmmakers and cultural workers in early 1952. In addition, being wary of the dangers of motion pictures deployed as ideological weapons by various international powers in the Cold War struggle, the British colonial administration clandestinely established the official film censorship regulations in 1953 to ban films with offensive or provocative content that might affect relations with neighboring states or create internal trouble. One of the responses of Hong Kong government's surveillance and control on screen culture was the disappearance of radical anti-colonial colonial elements and the patriotic theme of returning to the homeland in leftist films. Instead, Hong Kong Latvian cinema adopted a softer method to be both educational and entertaining, following the essential principle of guiding the audience to do good. This coincides with the fact that Hong Kong tenement films made around or after 1953 by the leftist camp focused more on the intricacies of human relationships and the hypocrisy of Catholic society by providing a clear sketch of the petty bourgeoisie and the lower classes within a dilapidated and overcrowded tenement house to allow a microcosmic look at the awful living condition of Hong Kong society. On the other hand, acknowledging the strategic significance of the psychological warfare in creating a global anti-communist campaign with the ultimate object of fighting back to the mainland, Jiang Jingguo launched a new initiative to utilize films as ideological vehicles for political propaganda. Since the film industry in Taiwan was too small and underdeveloped, the Kuomintang government viewed the colonial Hong Kong as a well-suited site to start a psychological battle for winning the hearts and minds of the diaspora Chinese across the world. The nationalist strategy of cinematic containment gained America's full support as it operated concurrently with the U.S. global efforts to counter the expansion of communist impact, especially in resource-rich, politically tempestuous Southeast Asia. With the assistance of several pro-Kuomintang film professionals, the Hong Kong and Kowloon Cinema and Theatrical Enterprise Free General Association Limited was established in 1957, which was actually under the sway of the nationalist authorities in Taipei, as it served as a censorship apparatus, a gatekeeper, which decided what Hong Kong films could be released in Taiwan, one of the major film markets of Hong Kong, when the mainland store was shut. Filmmakers and cultural workers affiliated with the Free Association were called free film workers, who were committed to a free cinema in support of free China, and their films could be circulated to the free world. Apart from supporting the exiled nationalist regime in its side war against pro-communist cinema in Hong Kong, the United States energetically engaged in funding covert propaganda efforts to curb the spread of the communist ideology, and the Asia Foundation was one of the American executive branches for the anti-communist cause in Asia, without bearing a U.S. label, for the purpose of disseminating throughout Asia a negative vision of mainland China, North Vietnam, and North Korea. In mid-1952, the CFA accepted a proposal entitled a three-dimensional project for the Battle for People's Mind from a pro-Kuomintang journalist based in Hong Kong named Zhang Guoxin to set up a three-pronged cultural apparatus composed of a publishing house, a film production company, and an intellectual club, which could mutually benefit each other in producing anti-communist books, magazines, and films. With financial assistance from the CFA and later the AF in secrecy, Zhang's anti-communist scheme was carried into effect with the Asia Press and the Asia Pictures established in Hong Kong in 1952 and 1953, respectively. As previously mentioned, after the communist takeover of China in 1949, Hong Kong became an asylum for a mass exodus of refugees from the mainland, the majority of whom were ex-Kuomintang cadres, their families and followers. These exiles, many of whom were middle-class professionals and intellectuals, now have to take up a marginalized existence collectively in a refugee camp located in Tuking Lane and learn to survive by doing odd jobs. As a consequence of this social reality, Hong Kong entered the age of literature of exile and refugee. Struggle of Humanism, which was written by the pro-nationalist intellectual Zhao Zifan and published by the Asia Press in 1953, gained enormous popularity among the nationalist sympathizers in Hong Kong and Taiwan. This anti-communist fiction was then adapted into a melodramatic film by Asia Pictures in 1955. Undoubtedly, halfway down is arriving repose to the left's Home Sweet Home, and the show must go on, as it captures the trials and tribulations of a class of intellectual exiles who fled from the communist-controlled China and formed a refugee community in a Hong Kong squatter settlement located in Tuking Lane. Different from the original fiction, marked by a strong and clear anti-communist stance. The political messages carried by the cinematic adaptation are implicit but unmistakable. To begin with, it is to escape the rule of a new totalitarian regime that these Chinese intellectuals become downtrodden refugees in the colonial Hong Kong. Besides, a approach of soil bought from their homeland by a dying professor functions to remind the exiled Chinese never to forget their mission to retake the mainland. Furthermore, the refugee community expressing in a song their wistful longing for homeland and their resolution to return home to kick out all the beasts, which signify the Chinese communist. The political implications of both the soil and the song echo the nationalist slogan of fighting back to the mainland. Last but not least, the film ends with this group of idealistic intellectuals remaining in the British colony with solidarity and hope, in spite of conflicts, plights, and torments, which indicates that they would rather endure sufferings and pains in exile for freedom than live in the communist-occupied China. Recently, I discovered a Hong Kong movie entitled The Mandarin Bowls, produced by the Writers' Camp in 1956. It is the first Hong Kong motion pictures filmed in English dialogues, which seems to have received scanty scholarly attention. The film tells a story about an American-born Chinese young lady named Eileen coming to Hong Kong for her dissertation on a mysterious pirate of the 1930s. In order to find the old manuscripts for her research project, Eileen visited a squatter settlement where accommodates an exiled Chinese professor. Eileen asked the professor why not move to the US, which conveys a propagandic message that the US is a free country, is a better environment. For the talk with the professor, we realized tens of thousands of Chinese refugees, many of whom are intellectuals and professionals, are taking shelter in Hong Kong after the mainland was occupied by the Chinese communists. At the end of the story, Eileen determines to remain in Hong Kong and cast her lot with an exiled Chinese young intellectual with his relief work in the refugee camp. Despite its melodramatic format and implicit anti-communist underpinnings, the film presents to its audience, in particular the English-speaking audience, about the mass migration of the Chinese from the communist China to the Crown Colony. The story ends with the lady from the US joining an exiled Chinese young intellectual in his welfare work, which could be interpreted through a cold lens that the US is in close collaboration with the pro-nationalist forces in providing humanitarian aid to the Chinese refugees fleeing from communist China. To briefly conclude, Hong Kong tenement dramas in the 1950s were more than just commercial or entertainment products, but ideological tools employed by both pro-communist leftists and pro-nationalist writers in the Cold War battles for hearts and mind under colonial censorship and market constraints. By casting an assortment of lodgers within a cramped tenement house, which is usually located in a slum, these films not only capture the diversity of the Chinese migrants and refugees taking shelter in the British Hong Kong, but enable multiple narrative threads to occur naturally so that a wider cross-section of the colonial society, whereas afflicted by the huge inrush of population from the mainland, the ensuing housing shortage, mass unemployment, poverty, and social inequality is displaced. The function of the tenement house in the storytelling is to provide a microcosmic look at the sufferings of the diasporic Chinese communities in the capital society of Hong Kong, but the renderings of refugee experience, the tales of exile, and the contesting claims of homeland were not simply cinematic representation of Hong Kong's social reality in the 1950s, but strategic narratives and cultural manifestations of political and ideological allegiance, which served a larger political objective for the identity politics of the diaspora Chinese amid the global Cold War struggle. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Linda, for this very interesting topic about the Hong Kong tenements films during the Cold War era. And thank you for presenting us those posters and screenshots. And that's very interesting to look. And so let's move on to our second presenter, Li Yuhong, who is currently a PhD student in Nanjing University, and his topic is about the transnational advocacy network under the Cold War. So, Li, can you start? I think you didn't open your volume.
Could you unmute, please?
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, very clearly.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Today I want to report you about the transformation of political identity. In our research, there are several concepts must be introduced to you first. And before my presentation, I introduce myself. I am a doctoral student at university and my master degree at Sun Yat-sen University, majoring in Southeast Asia international relations, and my bachelor degree at Donghua University in Taiwan is majoring in Pacific Regional History at present main research direction on Southeast Asia study. And in my study, I focus on the Cold War period and research on the political identity information transmission of group of Kuomintang Yunanese Chinese in northern Thailand. And I separate 4 parts about my research. And based on the Transnational Advocacy Network, and in preview study, the Transnational Advocacy theory is always applied to the research their network of non-governmental organizations. And however, during the Cold War, the United States often forced other countries to change their domestic policy, who almost replaced the role of NGO. Then the present study restructured the boomerang model to analyze the effect of the Thai and Taiwan United States when it comes to the political identity information transmission of the group of the political refugees during the 1950s to 1990s. And I want to define the Chinese in northern Thailand. After the World War II, with the break of the Cold War and the declining of Kuomintang in 1949 in the Kuomintang Communist Civil War, Chiang Kai-shek, the Kuomintang leader, withdrew most of its group with troops to Taiwan. Despite the Kuomintang repeat failure in the Civil War, Chiang didn't give up his determination to fight back the mainland China. He thought that there must be a base for counterattack, and the Yunnan became the place of this task. However, after the Chinese People's Liberation Army defeated the 8th and 26th armies of the last 2 troops of the Chinese mainland in January 1950, the situation in China was extremely unfavorable to Kuomintang, which led Kuomintang in its troops withdrew to completely in the rush of escape. Some of Kuomintang's troops retreated to Hainan and some to Vietnam. Li Guohui, head of 79 Regiment of 8th Army, led two people to flee to the border between Yunnan and Myanmar and join the 278 Regiment of the No. 6 Division, 93 led by Tan Zhao. The two armies were combined into a unit of about 1,500 people. However, Myanmar is in the process of constructing a modern nation state and is very sensitive to its border. The troops can only move from Yunnan Myanmar border to Thailand Myanmar border and northern Thailand. And we can see that it is northern Thailand and Chinese nationalists spread this area and restricted by the Cold War pattern. In northern Thailand were not immediately removed, but were placed as a secret force. The Taiwan government tried to use these troops to hide in the northern part of Thailand and carry out a strategy of fight back on the mainland China. Based on this, the United States believed that the troops can be used to implement containment strategy to prevent communists from spreading in Southeast Asia. Under the dual pressure of Taiwan and United States government, although unwilling, the Thai government agreed that army is in its territory but only in northern Thailand mountain. And we can see that this is the Chinese in northern Thailand definition. And however, for Kuomintang armies of northern Thailand, they represent not only the army force under the multiple pressure, but also transmission the political identity information as a Kuomintang army. The information represented by their political identity is Chinese armies. The Kuomintang army and National Army of Republic of China, these are ROC and today is Taiwan, and they thus convey the political message to the Taiwan government, hoping that the Taiwan government will assist the cooperation with the strategy of United States government and pressure the Thai government in exchange for acquisition of army focus and the garrison in northern Thailand. And secondary, I want to introduce our theory in the theoretical part. A few people use this theory to analyze the transmission of political identity in the past. In the past, this model was mostly used to explain the phenomena of transnational social movement. In our research, we modify this model to demonstrate our research on the dissemination of Chinese political identity in northern Thailand, and the transnational advocacy network is always applied in research the transnational social movement, while with no doubt that the right of residents and political refugees are commonly identified as an international event. The purpose of this study is to find out how to United States in the context of Cold War and substitute for non-government organization to influence international affairs to realize its hegemony. In the other hand, the traditional boomerang model was now working under extreme political circumstances. And on my study, I want to answer how is their political spread. It's about the Chinese in northern Thailand and how to interpret each political behavior Taiwan government and U.S. government of conspiration about the Chinese in northern Thailand. And this is a transnational advocacy theory model. We can see from the Chinese. We can see the model. In our model, we can first see that from 1950 to 1960, the Chinese in northern Thailand put pressure on the Taiwan and pass their identity. And to United States for the strategy of this deployment during the Cold War, the United States put pressure on the Thai government again, and prompting the Thai government to access the Chinese in northern Thailand can stay in the northern border area of Thailand. It can be said that the transmission of political identity is geopolitical phenomenon during the Cold War, and on the other hand, they can rectify the armament in the areas now far from Hunan, so as a counterattack at any time. So the most creative point of this research is to update the boomerang model by using 1970 as a boundary. We analyze the Chinese in northern Thailand past political to Taiwan and Thai government in two periods and to obtain all human rights like right of residence and something like food and money. And this in this new model, United States replaced the role of the non-governmental organization while the information was transmitted from Thai and Taiwan government, and the government of Thai actually changed their position several times under the pressure from the United States. And we can see the model, and in methodology, the research will analyze the literature related to the Chinese in northern Thailand and include the 3,000 miles of the alien land, 20 years of the reef. 就是中文名字是3000里路一个月，issued by the China and Association of Taiwan and China, and with some documentary works related to the rescue in Taiwan and China. In addition, it always includes reports and achieves of government agency in Taiwan, such as relief for difficult comparator in northern Thailand in government agency report, and other related documents like Taiwan government report, my country research on the future development trends of overseas China education policy. There are also some survey data of other scholars have also been used, such as Golden Triangle, Thai Burma cotton border interview by Chu Shengang from Taiwan, and Chinese village in northern Thailand from the Golden Triangle by Chinese scholar Wang and Wei Xiaoping, and this model was clearly explain the Chinese in northern Thailand how to transmit their message to the Taiwan, Thai, and USA. And I think this is my presentation. Thank you for everyone.
Okay, thank you, Yudong and his co-author Xiaqiu made this wonderful research over the Chinese in the northern Thailand transmitting their political identity. If you have any questions over their research, please feel free to leave a comment on our Q&A box. And of course, if you have questions for Linda, and you can also use that. We will look at it at the end of our all the presenters have finished their presentation. And let's welcome our third presenter, Mara. Mara is a PhD candidate in Latvian Academy of Culture, and his research is about the Russian speakers from Latvia. Identities called between Soviet past and present in Sweden. So, Maria, are you ready to present?
Yes, I am.
Thank you.
Hi to everybody. I should say good morning to everybody. I am calling from Sweden and it's morning here. So good evening and good morning to yes, so I'm going to talk about Russian speakers from Latvia and their so-called, you could tell, post-Cold War identities or post-Soviet identities caught between Soviet past and present in Sweden. A little bit about my research. So it's been ethnographic work conducted in Sweden as a part of my PhD work, and it is still ongoing research on Latvia's diaspora. And so far I've been interviewing 20 people in Sweden, and including 8 Russian speakers. And when I talk about Latvia's diaspora, I mean not only ethnic Latvians, but I mean all people who are, so to say, covered by this definition of Latvia's diaspora. Those are Russian speakers and Latvians, because there are almost 40% of people living in Latvia who are not Latvians. And there are different nationalities, but majority of them speak Russian, but you can't say that all of them are Russians. There are different nationalities who speak Russian. A little bit of introduction, why research on this theme and why it is so specific and interesting. So collapses of countries, we know, not always means the end of the past, and the same we can think about Soviet Union. It collapsed, but it has left marks in people's lives and formation of their identities. And many members of this community, this Russian-speaking community, have been living separate in separate information space since renewal of Latvia's independence from Soviet Union in 1991. And that has left marks on their identity, which I'm going to talk about a bit later. And my research focus is how collective memory have formed the post-Soviet and Russian-speaking identity. What happens when hybrid form of the identity built in Soviet and post-Soviet Latvia is introduced to the new surroundings in Sweden, which demand to adjust once more? Russians or Russian speakers? Yes, many people who speak Russian by mistake, they're called Russians, but it's not completely true because they have different nationalities, but what is united aspect that they speak Russian. And this is why some of the researchers like Cheskin has been mentioning that it is a specific identity which is built after collapse of Soviet Union, or you can call it Russian-speaking identity, and that is some kind of middle way or compromise between Russianness and Latvianness. David Leighton goes even further on, and he talks about Russian-speaking nationality, which is totally distinct from Russian identity. And yeah, Cheskin mentions that Russian speakers are, even though they are increasingly integrating into Latvian society, they still maintain the specific sense of group identity that is interestingly defined both in opposition and in synthesis with Russian and Latvian identities. So that is something in between which is being created there. Then in research, we talk about diaspora. It's not very, it's very often actually called as imagined community. And so diaspora, we can think about, talk about as imagined communities, the same like, yes?
Do you forget to roll down your presentation? Because we only see the first page.
Okay, but I am going forward, at least what I see.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, but is there some kind of technical issue, because Do you see the slide Imagine Community now?
No, we only see the first page.
Oh my, how could we fix it now? Because on my screen, I see totally the next slide coming up. I think I am just going continue to speak because it's going to be a little bit difficult to fix it now. Is that all right?
Oh, wait. What is this?
Because on my screen, I go forward with all of my slides.
Can you press the present button?
Can I press present?
It's on your left-hand side, upper corner.
Yes, but I have shared my screen, which you see. And wait a minute.
Stop sharing it, share it again.
Can you try stop sharing it and then restart and then?
Yes, I shall try to do it once more. Okay.
Okay.
Do you see it now?
Let's try move on to the next slide.
But I am already at next slide. Do you see it?
Then no.
Okay, but wait a minute. I have an idea. I might not open full screen. Maybe then you might see my next slide. Something is wrong with going to next slide. Do you see now the next slide?
Yes.
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 Okay, then we leave it this way, because unfortunately, when I go to full screen, it is just showing for me, and I'm very sorry for it. I don't know what's wrong.
That's all right.
Okay. Anyway, I am here at Imagine Community and Diaspora's Imagine Community. And as I told before, so Diaspora is a specific case of this Imagine Community, and Russian speakers in Latvia form a specific case of imagined community, which is not Russian diaspora and not Ukrainian or not Belarusian, but really Russian-speaking diaspora from Latvia. And what would be markers of this identity? Markers would be language, collective memory, and being somewhat in the opposition to the main community. Those markers of identity have built this Russian-speaking community in Latvia. And then when we think about this community, members of this community potentially moving to another country, yes, then we can indeed call them diaspora and diaspora, another hybrid situations that Russian speakers from Latvia and Sweden, you can think about them as another imagined community in another diaspora. Now I want to look into another term, which is being used by Homi Bhavka. Maybe many of you are familiar with third space. And this term one can apply to Russian-speaking community, as well as Bhavka speaks about this hybrid and borderline state of being, which is not identity itself, but a fluid process of identification, unholy experience, as he calls, being beyond, being somewhat caught between past and present. As well, we can talk about transnational non-belonging, where migrants might build a specific attachment to certain location or build specific time and space forms of belonging. And this is definitely, again, about when we think about Russian speakers from Latvia, either in Sweden or here, or if they are placed in Latvia. Collective memory is a very important marker when we think about building of identity, any identity, and the same goes to Russian-speaking identity, because our present is always affected by the past, and we need to keep in our minds that past is invented, it is reinvented, and it is reconstructed by the present. So present is definitely affecting how we see past. And the same goes to how we process and how we deal with collective traumas. That is as well affected by present, and it's carrying along this very emotional symbolic charge. Researcher Hirsch talks about generation of post-memory, when he talks about Holocaust survivors. But the same term we can surely apply to Russian-speaking identities and speaking about identities in general. So our memories, what we receive as a collective memories, to a big extent is transferred by our families. And then, of course, we carry along those memories and those experiences which comes from our families. Sometimes there can happen collision of collective memories in case if two communities live closely together, and then it can be affected by those two different narratives of history. For example, when we think about Latvians in Latvia and Russian speakers in Latvia, definitely those two groups are affected by different historical narratives, and there might be some collision and some conflicts arising. I'm going to tell about it a bit later. And because of those conflicts, of course, there are possibility and risks that there might be some marginalization of memory of the opposite side, that you want to announce your collective memory, your truth as the only one, and you are not wanting to look from another side, or so to put yourself in another person's shoes, or if we are talking about Latvians, yeah, it's sometimes difficult to understand how Russian speakers might think about one or another issue. And here is an exact example about collective memory in Latvia and about two colliding narratives. For example, from Russia's perspective, which is narrative of majority of Russian speakers in Latvia, the Red Army, very heroic way, liberated Europe from the grip of Nazism. And within the official Russian narrative, the Baltic states were not occupied, and the Soviet Union was able to bring many positive achievements to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. From another hand, from Latvian historical narrative, Stalinism is in the same evil light as Nazism, and Soviet era is usually portrayed as brutal, and it is being emphasized that Soviet Union been illegally occupying in previously independent states. So here we can see real collision of those two narratives. A little bit about results of my empirical research so far. What I found out that majority of Russian speakers defines their life in Latvia as parallel to the life of Latvian community, like living parallelly, having parallel life. Not seldomly, first contacts with Latvians were only in the university, and they are not capable, majority of them, to feel patriotic when Latvians celebrate, for example, National Day. They are not able to feel belonging to the Latvia as whole, but they are forming belonging and attachment to specific place, for example, to capital city Riga, and that correlates with previously mentioned research on transnational non-belonging, when a person builds this attachment to some location. And as well, there is, they've been talking about that they are incapable to feel belonging anywhere, and that is correlates with this research on third space situation, feeling in between. They've been expressing disappointment about their status, about the process of naturalization, the way how they are supposed to gain citizenship in Latvia, that they are born in Latvia, that they still need to go through the process of naturalization, like passing exam and proving their rights to be citizens, and they have been expressing disappointment about it. As well, views that different interpretations of history are being used to separate different communities and used in political games. So my interviewees have been expressing that they wouldn't think that this is such a big issue, this difference, but it is being used in political games. And as well, some of interviewees discovered and told me that when they actually started to communicate with Latvians, they discovered this existence of another narrative, for example, about the Second World War and its result, and it helped them understand that there might be other side of the story as well from Latvians. And at some cases, I noticed avoidance to discuss different sensitive historical narratives, which might point out that it is quite a sensitive issue still for that person, and it doesn't want to be talking about it or discussing or opening up about this issue. Then we talked about their identities in Sweden, how they define themselves. That was interesting to discover that they want to be defined as Russian speakers from Latvia and not Russians. And that was many times stressed out, that my home country is Latvia. I don't want to be associated with Russia. I am Russian speaker from Latvia. And they've been stressing out this difference between Russian speakers from Latvia and Russian speakers from other countries, telling that, for example, if they try to find contacts with diaspora organizations from Russia, they can't connect to those people. They don't feel they belong. They feel they are not them. And a little bit of conclusions on the work which is still in progress. Russian speakers from Latvia are not ethnically homogeneous groups. They are, as a result of living in post-Soviet space, they form a specific Russian-speaking identity with their own identity markers, language, collective memory, being in the opposition to the mainstream community. And there is strong wish to be associated with Latvia, even though ties with Latvia might be less strong due to incapability to form a deep and meaningful belonging and connection. And here we come again to the term third space, being the third space, being in between, feeling somewhat not capable to formulate their own identity and their own belonging. Some of them want to formulate themselves as they are cosmopolitans. It's maybe like a middle way, how to go about it, how to find some kind of solution for this situation, being between and being not able to belong. And that's all. And thank you for listening. And I'm really apologizing for issue regarding my presentation, not being able to share the full screen with you. If there are any questions, you are welcome to ask.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you, Mara. Despite the technical interruption, we still have a great understanding of your research concerning the Russian speakers' identities and collective memories in Latvia and their feelings of in between. So let's move on to the Q&A section. Shall I read this question? I found a question for Linda and I will read this, and Linda, if you don't mind, you can answer it. Hi, Linda, thank you for your interesting talk. My question is, how did the Cold War politics influence the reception of these films? So do you want to answer?
Yes.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, actually, in my paper, I do discuss the reception part of some of these films. For instance, when the film Halfway Down was completed in 1955, it was circulated for public screening in the Southeast Asian countries and districts that belong to the free world, beginning from Taiwan, Singapore, Thailand, and Hong Kong. But the nationalist critics were unsatisfied with the cinematic adaptation, criticizing that transforming a vivid anti-communist social realist story into an ordinary romantic melodrama made the anti-communist political ideology in the film much less powerful than that in the original novel. But the film's oblique attack on the Chinese communists should be seen more or less as a strategic response to the colonial censorship, colonial government's draconian censorship. On the other side, under the constraints of censorship, leftist tenement films made around and after 1953, such as The Dividing Wall and Between Fire and Water, on the surface they are social realist cinemas offering audience moral education through a true-to-life representation of the problems in the colonial city, without explicit anti-colonial sentiment, but the subtle political implication that it was the colonial situation of Hong Kong that victimized the general masses, actually could be discerned by the Southeast Asian moviegoers who were able to identify with the film characters for their shared experience. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess there is a question from Kenny. So could you unmute?
So can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm just speaking from my office without the video. So I have a question, comments on Linda's presentation. So yeah, thanks, Linda. I think you give a rather broad and comprehensive background about the themes you want to discuss in relation to the Cold War, particularly about the ideologies. But I wonder if you can talk more about what do you mean by the tenement film, rather whether as a genre or as a group of films with certain characteristics, aesthetics, or storytelling regarding them, and how they are shared by groups of even diverse ideologies. So do you have any example, okay, to elaborate more about what do you mean by the tenement films in your discussion, okay, in your project?
Thank you for the question. Well, actually, I think, recently I have written an article tracing the lineage of tenement drama from Marcin Gorky's The Law Deaths to the Shanghai lay house dramas in the 1930s and 1940s to Hong Kong cinema, to Hong Kong tenement films in 1940s and the 50s, and I think within this cinematic space, the tenement house to me now it is kind of a cinematic form instead of a genre, because it is shared. It can be shared by different. How do you say? I think to make it simple, I think it is both ideological camps made this kind of cinematic space within a tenement house to portray the sufferings or the life of the residents in Hong Kong, especially the underclass. So for a microcosmic look of the Hong Kong society. So this is what I mean as a tenement drama. It is so far I will define it as a cinematic form instead of a genre. Can I make my answer clear?
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kenny and Linda. Do we have any questions for other two presenters?
I can ask a question.
Yes,
do you have
please.
any questions? Or I can ask a question. Okay, thank you. Thank you for those three wonderful presentations. And I have a question addressing all of them. So this is a question for all the speakers. I felt that I'm not sure about the second one, so that would be a question in itself as well, but especially first and third, but maybe even the second one, a kind of lack a closure in what were the conclusions or outcomes? How was the non-belonging and displacement resolved? How it could be resolved? This is something that we can speculate, perhaps more in the case of Russian speakers from Latvia. in how it could be resolved, but maybe even in Hong Kong. And it's interesting, this conference is about the Cold Wars, and the Cold Wars depend and are actually framed and completely dependent on the ideas of geographical and political delineations. And our sense of belonging or nationality and citizenship and history is also something that we associate with, or that is framed and defined by geographical and political and national borders. And so that the sense of home in the modern sense of the word home is an outcome of the belonging into the modern nation state. So, which on the one hand, because human rights are also dependent on the geographical and political delineations and framework, but I was wondering to what extent this modern sense of belonging in the frames of, or framed and defined by the modern nation state, could be countered by what I see in all three presentations, and that is the idea of transnationalism and transculturalism. And is it possible that this becomes a sense of belonging and citizenship? Is it possible that this becomes a way of formation of identity and transnational history, transnational sense and transcultural and transnational sense of belonging and history? And that especially I would like to also connect with the Homi Bhabha's idea of in-between space, which I actually see as and he's very optimistic and positive about this in-between space because it's a hybrid space. So it's, again, a very transcendent space where you have the opportunity to transcend the binary of the both sides and become something else. So in-betweenness is not necessarily, at least in my reading, being stuck, but being a possibility for a new kind of identity and a new kind of existence. So that would be my question to all the speakers. Please feel free, whoever would like to address that. Thank you.
Well, if I may start first. Well, thank you for a very interesting note, and yes, indeed, you are right. In between us in research is being seen as a possibility as well. That's correct. And this situation, as I see it, regarding those Russian speakers from Latvia who haven't found yet this next stage, or how to say, how to be in comfortable state of being in between. So I would say that is ongoing process for them personally as well, and for them as a group, I would imagine, because those tendencies happen not just for Russian speakers. I think we see in the modern world this not transnational belonging that is our modern state of being, pretty much, considering those different constellations of families we now build comparing to previous times. And those different constellations of identities which the child which comes out from those families might build and might choose in one period of their life or in another one. So what I see in research, really identity and making yourself, creating yourself, recreating yourself, that is ongoing process. And that's always has been so. It is just more visible maybe nowadays because of those all constellations we have, because people been always having, I believe, hybrid identities. It is just very actual to speak about them, actually to notice them because of our situation, what we see, what is happening. Well, at least before COVID time, that it was really this free movement and people could travel and could choose to start life elsewhere, just like that. And that would be short, in short, my answer to the question. Maybe Linda wants to add something.
Thank you. We can read the question if no response.
Are there any responses to the formal questions? Well, if not, there is also a question on the question box for Mara. So let me read first and you can answer it. A question to Mara: how much the market value of the Russian language, that is possibility to find a job as a Russian speaker perpetuates the linguistic community? It is something intensely observed in the Soviet diasporas here in Greece. So, Mara, do you want to address it?
Yes, sure. I just want to understand if that question is being asked about Russian speakers in Sweden or Russian speakers in Latvia, because those would be different situations. But I can try to answer both. So I wouldn't say that, yeah, in some situations you might have it as an advantage to have Russian as a language here in Sweden, but not really. That wouldn't be exactly as a language on demand if you are in a job market looking for a job. But if when it comes to Latvia, I would say even it is official language in Latvia, just Latvian, but there are still many jobs and many places which actually want that when you look for a job that you can speak Russian as well. And that's a real problem for younger generation to be younger generation Latvians, I mean, to be finding a job because they don't speak Russian anymore. And that gives actually somewhat an advantage to Russian speakers who can speak both Russian and Latvian. Advantage in a job market, for example, to find a job in a shop, to find a job in a restaurant, in customer service, in other words, where you need to address client the language they actually speak to you. So that's an interesting situation, even though the official language in Latvia is Latvian. So there might be situations that it is an advantage that you are a Russian speaker. If that answers your question, I don't know. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any last questions before we end the session? Speakers, you're also free to ask questions if you'd like to. We've had previously interesting discussions, but if not, then no questions. Then
that's enough this section. Thank you very much for the 3 wonderful presenters, and thank you very much for those who are listening to our conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.